Welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilled life possible. Human flourishing and human progress depend on how people use their minds. And a person's basic ideas are like a computer's operating system. If a computer's operating system has bugs and it's vulnerable to viruses, it wreaks havoc on the machine and its user. And likewise, if a person's fundamental ideas about the nature of the world, his means of gaining knowledge, and what he ought to do with his life are wrong, they ruin his life. And this is true not only of individuals, but of entire cultures. Before the scientific revolution, before the industrial revolution, the American Revolution, a critical mass of people adopted certain ideas and a characteristic means of using their minds. And likewise, before the Crusades, before the Nazi concentration camps, the gulags of Soviet Russia, the mass famine of Maoist China, a critical mass of people adopted different ideas and a different means of using their minds. If we call the first the operating system of progress, we might call the second the operating system of regress or of retreat. And this basic alternative, this conflict, goes back at least as far as ancient Greece. Some people have said that the history of the world is a battle between the ideas of Plato and those of Aristotle. And I think if we want to understand and maintain human progress and flourishing, then we have to understand this divide, including its two most important exponents for our world today, Immanuel Kant on the side of Plato and Ayn Rand on the side of Aristotle. So today I want to give a basic overview of their ideas, some of their arguments, and why I think they fall into the camps that they do. And in future episodes, we're going to do a series of episodes on these figures and talk about their ideas in more depth and why it is the case that some of them are architects of progress, if you will, and others are architects of regress or of retreat. So let's dive in with Plato. The basic idea that I'm going to argue in more depth in a future episode, probably the next episode, is that Plato held that an elite have a monopoly on knowledge and so should rule. They should rule over all other people. He held that knowledge requires transcending this world of perception and rising to a higher, more perfect, more moral world of abstraction, which he called the world of forms or ideas. Plato was attempting to answer a question that has a long history in ancient Greek philosophy. He wanted to find out what it is that makes any given thing the type of thing that it is. What makes a chair or a dog a dog? There are many chairs in the world and many dogs, but each and every one is different, and none of them are eternal. We don't see chairness or dogness if we look out at the world. We only see particular chairs and particular dogs. Yet universals have to be real because that's what we rely on for knowledge. That's what we refer to when we define a dog or a chair or talk about these things in general, in the abstract. So what are the universals and how do they relate to the particulars? Plato said that beyond this world, there's an immaterial, non-spatial, immortal world of forms, and that the things in this world are merely imperfect reflections of those forms. There are particulars which come and go, and they're of lesser importance than the things in the world of forms. So we'll dig in much more deeply into this basic idea of Plato's in future episodes, but I just want to get the outline across so you guys can see where I'm going with this operating system of progress versus operating system of regress thing. So the forms exist in this higher reality, and this requires patient study. Plato isn't very specific about what exactly enables the intellectual elite to eventually gain knowledge of this world of forms. It's sort of this mysterious process. You've got to be 40 or 50 years old, have spent decades studying the forms, and at some point you just have something like an epiphany or a revelation. But the average Joe is too busy living his life, working at his job, raising his family, to study the supposed higher reality. Only the philosophers, only the intellectual elite can do that. Only they have the time to spend gaining knowledge. And ultimately, Plato's going to argue that because they have a monopoly on knowledge, they ought to rule over the populace. Now, this idea has had massive ramifications throughout history, but I just want to pause for a moment and think about how it's perhaps being applied right now. Think about your experience with people regarding vaccines, regarding the science behind vaccines, the science behind COVID, the science behind the spread of disease, mask wearing, all of these things. Perhaps you've run into people that seem to claim a monopoly on scientific knowledge about these subjects and want to enforce their ideas. If so, then you have witnessed an echo of this idea. I know what's best, therefore I should rule, and I should be able to have the authority to tell you how to live your life. So this is a very high-level sketch of Plato's philosophy, and it's often characterized as otherworldly, as mystical, whereas Aristotle, who was Plato's student, but later came to disagree with Plato on every single fundamental of philosophy, had a very different view of knowledge, which opened the door to modern ideas on self-government. So Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, and I should mention Plato's dates, 428 to 348 BC. So in contrast to Plato's otherworldly world of forms, Aristotle held that only the world of perception exists, that knowledge consists in understanding this world and making the most of that knowledge. Here's just one illustrative fact that demonstrates the difference between Plato and Aristotle. Plato thought that mathematics was the paradigm intellectual discipline. He even had a sign above the entrance to his school that said something like, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." And think about what mathematics is and does. It deals with the world by getting rid of all of the messy data and focusing solely on numerical units. Aristotle, by contrast, is known to us as the father of biology. He collected thousands of plants and animals, thousands of specimens, studied them intensely, studied their life cycles, their development, their reproduction, and took pages and pages and pages of detailed notes about different biological specimens. He was obsessed with the world of observation and believed that all our knowledge comes ultimately from the facts that we observe. So, whereas Plato started with abstract ideas housed in another world, a non-physical, non-temporal, non-spatial world, and attempted to deduce consequences from ideas, Aristotle started from observation and built up from that observation to more abstract conclusions. So this is why people commonly characterize Plato as having his head in the clouds, whereas Aristotle had both feet planted firmly on the ground. He was a man of this world, not postulating other worlds that are more important than this one. His exact thoughts on the nature of universals is actually a topic of hot debate even today. Different translators translate words in different ways that make it sound as if Aristotle had different theories of universals. So I'm not going to come down on one side or another or even try to summarize that debate here. But I think that any way you slice it, Aristotle believed that the source of universals is here in this world. It is the actual things that we perceive. That's where we derive our universal concepts, our more abstract concepts like chair and dog, the chairness and the dogness. Where does that come from? It comes from evidence here in this world, not, as Plato said, from some other world of forms. Now, Plato's influence reigns during the Middle Ages. It is deeply inspirational to religion and the development of religion. And then Aristotle's influence surges again during the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. Basically, it is the foundation for the modern world. But we're going to skip over all the juicy details and go right to a man who is considered to be an Enlightenment philosopher. I actually consider him to be an anti-Enlightenment philosopher, Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804. Kant consolidated many different anti-Enlightenment currents that came to the surface during the Enlightenment, consolidated these into a philosophy that, in essence, rejects the Enlightenment and revives Plato's dual world view, a world of things as they actually are and a world of mere appearance, where we can still do things like science, but really all this tells us, as we'll see, is about ourselves and not about the world as it actually is. One of the most telling lines in all of Kant's philosophy is one that he states very early on in his critique of pure reason. He says, "I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. And what he's doing here and throughout his philosophy is opening the door back up to the mystical essence of Plato's philosophy. And we'll see more of why that is as we go on, both in today's show and in a future episode, maybe several. So I love how the philosopher David Stove characterizes Kant's philosophy. He says that Kant offered the biggest, though also the simplest bluff ever tried. End quote. He supposed that the world is cut in two. As I said, there's this world of appearance in which we live and experience our lives, and that he called the phenomenal realm. This realm is governed by scientific principles. It's the world that we know. But the world as it actually is, the noumenal realm, as he called it, lies beyond the bounds of our experience and comprehension. And this should sound very familiar. It is very, very similar to Plato's idea of the forms. But it's a little bit more skeptical because Plato at least held that the intellectual elite somehow would become familiar with this world of forms. He didn't really specify, but some sort of mystical process by which they learn about these forms and thus become informed. Kant says that there is a definite, enduring, unbridgeable separation between these two realms, and that we have no means of knowing the other realm. And that, of course, raised the questions for the philosophers that followed Kant. Well, if we have no means of knowing this other realm, then how do you, Kant, know that it exists? And apparently the implication is that Kant found the magic door to reality as it really is, and the rest of us are ignorant and have to take his word for it. Again, that should probably sound pretty familiar. Now, as for this scientifically governed realm of experience, said Kant, thinkers went astray when they tried to explain how the mind grasps reality. Just as Copernicus had flipped on its head the common view that the sun revolves around the earth, so Kant prosecutes what he calls a Copernican revolution in knowledge. He supposes that the mind does not grasp reality, rather it shapes reality. The human mind has this elaborate network of filters, like rose-colored glasses, but they affect all our different sense modalities. And he called these the categories. The categories impose a specific structure on incoming sense data. For example, the mind, he thinks, contains a causality filter. So you light a match, you feel the fire, you feel a burning sensation. Most of us would think, well, the fire is causing the burning. But, says Kant, well, that's just the causality filter kicking in. Our minds impose this idea of causality on things in this world. So our sciences in general tell us less about the world as it actually is than they do about how our minds organize and structure human experience. The skeptical implications of Kant's views were then drawn out and clearly demonstrated by his 19th century successors, including Johann Fichte, G.W.F. Hegel, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Arthur Schopenhauer, and many more. And I want to talk in future episodes about how Kant's ideas have echoed on down through the ages, to inspire postmodernism and everything up to today's critical race theory. But we'll save that for a later episode. For today, one more point about Kant, and it has to do with his morality, his theory of ethics. So just as we have categories that shape our views of things like entities and causality, we also have a category for morality, a morality filter. Kant called this the categorical imperative, and today we might just refer to it as someone's conscience. But it's an internal commandment. It's a sense of duty that tells us to repudiate our personal desires, sacrifice our values, and not for the sake of anything, just sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice. Now, I want to skip way ahead in the history of philosophy. There are many other important figures that I would love to talk about at some point on this show. But to stick with our program here, we're going to move on to Ayn Rand, 1905 to 1982. And Ayn Rand essentially aimed to save the Enlightenment by reviving Aristotle's this-worldly approach and fortifying it against the sort of mutant Platonism unleashed by Kant and his followers. Rand said, quote, "On every fundamental issue, Kant's philosophy is the exact opposite of objectivism." Objectivism being Rand's philosophy. Kant had said in essence that because the senses have their own specific nature, they impose that nature on the things we perceive and thereby distort our perception of those things. So there's a divide between appearance and reality. And in order for us to perceive, we need to, in effect, get reality directly without the aid of sense organs, in Kant's view. And Rand says this is absolutely false. Yes, the senses, like all things, our means of perception, do have a specific nature. And the process of perception, though, unfolds by inexorable natural law. It unfolds in accordance with the natures of all the entities involved. So, to take a classic example, if you dip a straight stick in water and it appears bent, that's not evidence of the sense's deficiency and inability to show us reality. In fact, it's proof of the fact that the senses cannot ignore reality. They can't ignore any aspect of what it is they perceive. In this case, the fact that light travels through air and water at different velocities. So that's one instance of how Rand and Kant differ. That's from epistemology, the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge and how we come to know the world. Let's take another example from ethics. Rand held that values are objective. They aren't baked into reality by God's will, intrinsic to the nature of the universe given what God preordained. Rather, values depend on, they derive from, the requirements of life. And life is the precondition of all values. So all living beings, whether it be a plant, an animal, human being, some sort of alien that we're not aware of, everything that's alive needs certain values to remain alive. And the nature of the organism determines the values it needs in order to survive. So values are based on facts. The plant needs a certain amount of sunlight and water, needs certain nutrients from the soil. A lion needs meat and shade. A man needs food, shelter, and so on. And for men, there are many optional values. A man may prefer pork or beef, but the fact that he must eat food and not poison in order to live is not optional. So the nature of reality sets the standard of value. The standard of value is objective, and man must use his mind to produce the values that he needs in order to survive. Not only this, but whereas Kant held, I didn't mention this before, but Kant held that a man's duty requires that if the supreme ruler violates his rights, he must grin and bear it. He has no right to revolt. Rand, by contrast, held that man has a right to his own life. He has a right to use what he produces to make his life as good as it can be, so long as he doesn't violate the equal rights of others. So to summarize Rand's view, the world and everything that exists has a specific nature, and although we might wish to change that nature, wishing alone won't make it so. Reality, in order to be commanded, must be obeyed, as Francis Bacon put it. Humans must use reason to gain knowledge of reality so that they can attain the values that enable them not only to survive, but to thrive. But reason is an attribute of each individual man, and a mind cannot be forced by others. As John Locke put the point beautifully, such is the nature of the understanding that it cannot be compelled to the belief of anything by outward force. End quote. So all human beings have individual rights to act on their own judgment, so long as they don't violate the equal rights of others, and the only legitimate purpose of government is to safeguard those rights. So this is a big summary, a big overview of these ideas on the operating system of progress versus the operating system of regress and the people that have made a difference one way or the other. And I plan to go into much greater detail on each of these figures in future episodes, but I figured to kick it off, I would get the overarching agenda on the table for you. And if you're interested in these figures and perhaps others, maybe I'll go into others as well, then keep your eyes peeled for future episodes on each of them. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy flourishing.